ICT services and solutions are what we do. Relationships are what we're about. Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.
Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was a country where people were separated by virtue of the color of their skin.
South Africa, after 300 years, finally saying, you know, this is going to be a country where everyone counts.
Was the South African story a miracle?
We are starting a new era.
On the 27th of April 1994, we were finally given the opportunity to vote.
This first free, fair, democratic election.
Good prevailed, justice prevailed, because people insisted on it.
Our fight, our Constitution, our democracy is definitely one to look at and to learn from.
Colours of the rainbow moved out of each other's way to accommodate.
To show how negativity can be transformed into positivity.
To rise in such a way that your vision transcends what you even thought was possible.
I am proud to hold your hand for us to go forward.
I never thought I would see the end of apartheid in my lifetime.
I did not think that it would happen.
How did we avoid continuing to the point where we did not care whether we destroyed all life?
Bam! Total darkness. Total darkness. I don't know what's happening, and another kind of a shudder. And I know something terrible's happening, and some time passes. And into the darkness, I say, what happened? And a woman's voice says, it was a car bomb. And I faint back into unconsciousness, but with a sense of joy. I'd survived. I've only lost an arm. It was the bomb that blew off my arm that revived my spirit, and joy came back into my life when I survived that. I like to feel that there's a kind of fairness that runs through history that gives us a chance to make a better society. But history isn't always fair to individuals. Ruth First, a brilliant journalist, writer, thinker. She's locked up under the 90-day law in solitary confinement.
It was a cat and mouse game, but a game without an end.
My mother couldn't work in South Africa anymore because they banned her. They banned her from pursuing her profession as a journalist.
She goes into exile, I go into exile. She makes a film about her experience, a film's made about my experience. She goes to Mozambique, I go to Mozambique. I'm blown up by a car bomb, I survive.
She was teaching in the university in 1982 when she opened an envelope of a letter that had been sent to her.
I was in the office, and Ruth came back with a pile of mail. And she was standing 4 or 5 paces to my left.
There was a bomb inside of it. It had been put there by the South African police, and it killed her instantly. She never got back to see a free South Africa.
I remember when we buried Ruth, her husband, Joe Slovo, weeping and crying. It was a terrible moment. first had 3 daughters. One of the things that they did was attend the proceedings of the Truth Commission.
The purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to find a settlement. Come and tell us what you did. You don't even have to be sorry. No remorse is required. Just come and disclose what happened, acknowledge what had happened, in response to which you will be given amnesty.
I don't think anybody could fail to be moved by the hearings that Desmond Tutu chaired.
I don't know how your greatness would be enhanced if you were to say, sorry, things went wrong, forgive me.
Many people thought that there should be a much more severe reckoning after all these decades of apartheid.
You don't end the problem by telling the truth. But I think it's a hugely valuable and important part of a process that allows a country to move forward.
Slovo R, Ruth First, was regarded in the security police as a terrorist and was in the terrorist album.
I sat in front of this mountain of a monstrous man. He was one of the people who was, as he calls it, in the loop that sent the bomb that killed my mother.
Craig Williamson applied for and was granted amnesty. And it wasn't easy to come forward in front of the television cameras to say everything that he did. So this is what that man, that smiling man, who seemed to be so plausible and friendly, this is what he did.
There was an implication. If you were in the terrorist album, you were a terrorist. And I was in the terrorist album at a stage, yes, Mr. Chair.
The notion was that we will offer amnesty for truth.
I don't think that Craig Williamson told the truth about what he did. To really talk the truth about having taken a human being's life, you have to face it, and that's very hard to live with yourself when you do that.
There comes a great difficulty in one's life.
In the process of watching them applying for amnesty for these deaths, I think I did find out the emotional truth of what had happened. He, in a way, felt himself to be a victim. He didn't think of my mother as his victim. He didn't seem to understand that he had taken a life.
And what has been difficult for me is the hatred that I feel emanating out of him towards my family.
We didn't have the evidence for convictions, even if we'd wanted to. And then who do you go for? Craig Williamson? Or the commander? Or the minister in the government? Or the president of the country? And there would have been thousands and thousands of people on trial because they were all supporting apartheid in different ways. And how would our country have moved forward?
I would prefer them to be in jail for the rest of their lives. They were murderers.
Sending them to jail, I don't know. It wouldn't have brought Ruth back. Getting the kind of constitution that Ruth believed in, that justified Ruth's struggles and gave sense to the sacrifice that she made.
It was a political compromise, and I support that political compromise. And if my mother's life was to make any sense, I am prepared to live by the TRC's decision. Is that a good enough exchange for justice? I don't think it's a swap that I would have made.
It is normally assumed that if someone does you wrong, then you take retribution.
It's the age-old question, right? Revenge, what is considered fair, what is considered justice.
But there were so many people in South Africa who were able to come forth and say, I forgive.
It is the hater who can be so consumed by the hatred that in the end you fail to find moments and opportunities where you can actually resolve a problem.
We were greatly privileged to be part of an incredible process of healing.
My mother's name was Pilapo Shandwandwe. I was about 10 years old. They were having a mass burial for people who were killed back then. that I know about her was from the TRC. I always felt that maybe her exit in life was my entrance in this world.
It was already in my mind that if she did not want to cooperate and work as an informer for us, she would be eliminated.
Phila Ndwandwe was an Mkontu Wesizwe guerrilla fighter.
All these years, 8 years or so, we didn't know really what happened to our sister. You know, she just disappeared.
As was the case in those days, she was functioning under a different name.
My dearest Dad, I know a letter from me is listed in the Christmas holidays. I miss you. As your daughter, it is rather my fault for not writing to your loving daughter, Pila. It's not advisable to keep my letters.
Well, the security police were able to crack this, and they found out who she was. They arrested her, and they held her in a small room, and they tortured her. They stripped her naked, they beat her up, they shot her dead, and she was buried in a shallow grave.
The man who'd executed her and commented how brave she'd been before she died was the one who led the investigators to the grave, because he went to the Truth Commission.
Did you believe that you could kill in order to pursue a political motive?
The killing would have only been, any killing is only justified in a war situation, and I was bound by that ethic.
Graf van Phila Ndwandwe.
She died here, just around our doorstep. That was the most painful thing.
And they dug her bones up. They found this packet that she had wrapped around herself in respect of modesty.
This looks like an entrance.
How do you expect people who've been through that, her family, how do you expect them to be reasonable?
Did the informers that informed you about her tell you that she was breastfeeding?
Negative, Chairperson. For me, the TRC, it was just a process of closure, you know. If they had never come forward, I would never have known that I had a mother. Hating that person and holding that anger, it's not going to help me in any way.
Human beings have a tremendous capacity to be reasonable, to be compassionate, even in the most extreme situation, and say, okay, let's move on.
Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.
With the violence spreading rapidly through the coloured townships, the police decided to hit back hard. In what appears to have been a carefully planned ambush, they sent in an unmarked lorry. The crowd started to stone it. Police opened fire at close range on a crowd of youths and children. At least 3 coloured youths were killed outright before they could take cover. The police were able to finish their operation, climb back into their boxes and go.
If I was to rewind the tape to 25 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to imagine South Africa looking like it does today.
Nobody in the world thought there was ever going to be a solution for the South African conflict.
I had grave doubts. The sides were so deeply entrenched. The issues that divided people were so complex, and I just could not see the potential for change.
There is nothing automatic that human society will move forward.
The average native, to my mind, is a very good fellow, provided he's not interfered with from outside. I think the native, left to the people who know how to handle them, certainly is a fine fellow. I've had no trouble. I've been on this farm for 4 years now, and quite frankly, I haven't prosecuted one single boy. There was no need for it.
History has a way of making ideas that once had some support look ridiculous.
I think there's a little bit of a misconception about where apartheid started. It started in 1652, when the first Europeans came to Africa. They brought with them the paradigm in terms of superiority and inferiority. They always thought they were superior to the people who are indigenous to Africa. It was a paradigm of more than 300 years.
Years and years of people not feeling like they were equal to another race.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness.
It didn't only rob black people of their dignity, it robbed us.
White people's humanity was diminished by their acquiescence and their direct involvement in the assaults on the humanity of black people.
The oppressor carries the burden and the weight of the pain of he who is oppressed.
Once you come to believe that a difference in culture, a difference in status is actually a difference in kind, then you're capable of all sorts of atrocities.
You create a logic where you define people as inferior.
Oppressive, bullying society.
In a way, they didn't even know what they were doing.
It was one of the most evil. Into a new world.
On an occasion like this, words fail one.
We try to achieve our objects by peaceful means along non-violent lines.
South Africa must and shall belong to all who live in it, black and white.
Violence cannot benefit us. Violence cannot benefit anybody.
I got involved in armed struggle to bring about a peace in this country.
Take your guns, your knives, and your pangas, and throw them into the sea.
Throughout our revolution, we've had really wise leaders, a leadership that had vision.
Bold, brainy, brave decision makers.
These people were politicians in a much wider sense because they were part of a political struggle, and that isn't the same as being in government.
We had a leadership grown in the country. We had a leadership in exile, and we had a leadership sitting in prison.
Mandela described himself before he went into prison as an angry young man filled with bitterness.
Now, if Dr. Verwoerd's government doesn't give you the kind of concessions that you want sometime soon, is there any likelihood of violence?
I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate. I have fought. I
against white domination, and I have fought against black domination.
Does it lead?
Each of us are shaped by our experiences.
Hardship creates the man and the woman. You find out who you are by how you respond to circumstances.
And what Mandela went through brought out the best in him.
His years in prison gave him the time to think, the time to read, the time to formulate.
June the 16th, 1976.
Students simultaneously marched out of 5 schools in Soweto.
The regime tried to introduce Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in all African schools.
We were forced to learn in a language that for us was an oppressor's language.
The township exploded.
While that was going on, Mandela raised the question, and he says, in this situation, in this war, it's going to be crucial to understand the enemy. You need to get into his head and think how he would think. We have to start learning to speak Afrikaans. Bloody hell.
He insisted on understanding the other, that we could not solve our problem if we didn't speak the Afrikaans language, if we didn't read their literature, if we didn't understand who we were facing.
One is amazed by the fact that after 27 years of incarceration, he could come out to demonstrate emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, social intelligence, and spiritual intelligence.
President Mandela, here to perform perhaps his most extraordinary act of reconciliation, to meet Betsy Verwoerd, the 94-year-old widow of Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd.
Ik wens u geluk, mevrouw Verwoerd.
Mandela was smart enough to learn Afrikaans, not only stand in the shoes of his enemy, but sing in their language and in their voice.
Nelson Mandela putting on the jersey, putting on the cap.
That's extraordinary.
He had a transformation in prison and saw a way to open up the possibility of freedom, not just for himself and fellow prisoners, but for the entire country. This would not have happened had there been a different kind of man.
Nelson Mandela came out of prison not consumed by bitterness.
And he realized that if anger was your driving motivation, you were no longer a free person. After 27 years, it just was breathtaking.
One of the things about somebody like Mandela is he also is a consummate politician.
He was, as a politician, interested in becoming the next president of South Africa. And he knew very well that he would certainly be unable to become president of South Africa without finding a political agreement with the powers that be at the time.
And when people like myself got to prison, we found in him a person who was already practicing those skills. We put Mandela as our spokesman. The overall head of the prison service, General Steyn, he began to converse with Mandela. And this is where Mandela pulled something that I have never ceased to be amazed with. In his firm but quiet voice, he said, General, you and I are on opposite sides of this war. One day, even when we have fought to the point where we have reduced our country to ashes, and one side emerges as victor and the other side as vanquished, you and I will have to meet, even over those ashes. The quality of that moment will depend on how you and I have treated each other today. That's something we need to think about. I have seldom been as empowered because I then understood what it is to uphold one's dignity in a way that compels the other side to respect you.
It was the force of Mandela's personality and the force of the decisions he took that allowed South Africa to take that peaceful step for itself and to be such an example to the world.
He has just infused so many of us in this world that he'll always be walking among us.
doesn't know where they were when he came out of prison.
I never will forget it as long as I live.
I think I was in tears, and along with lots of others.
I got Chelsea up. She was about 9 at the time. I said, they're letting Mandela go today. This may be the most important thing you ever see.
People remember Nelson Mandela getting out of prison the way they remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. It was, you know, some giant steps.
The government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally.
After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked out today a free man.
And there is an excitement in the crowd.
I did not have a Damascus Road experience, where one evening I went to bed firmly believing in apartheid, and the next morning I saw the light and said apartheid is all wrong. It was a process.
That one move of letting Mandela out of jail turned out to be the key moment.
We had to admit to ourselves that we had landed in a place which was morally indefensible.
De Klerk, for him to have done what he did was tantamount to a miracle.
He could either go down in history as someone who oversaw the last sputterings of the apartheid government, or as someone who had truly changed not just South Africa, but the world.
It goes deeper than that. For one to make a real paradigm shift, you have to put your soul on the block. Whether FW had made that shift remains a question.
To try and understand the man who'd broken the apartheid regime's stranglehold of some 40 years, you've really got to take a trip into the desert of South Africa's Northern Cape. It's the late 1980s, and a long-kept secret of the NP is about to be discovered.
Есть снимки со спутника. Передайте их американцам. У нас есть доказательства. Южная Африка обладает ядерным потенциалом.
When I became president, one of the first things I did was to call that need-to-know group together and to say, I think the time has arrived for us to get rid of the nuclear weapons. We had 6 already completed and a 7th near to completion.
The voluntary dismantling of a nuclear deterrent capability and the voluntary revelation of all relevant information will confirm this government's effort to assure transparency.
The disarming of the nuclear weapons gave South Africa a special moral voice in the world.
It was a major decision, and it was another leap of faith.
Having built this program in secret, this nuclear weapons program, to then voluntarily give these up as one of the first major acts that President de Klerk did, I thought, and I do believe, is very, very strong.
That was a critical strategic move.
And I think it made him a much more transparent partner for peace.
In my decision to dismantle, the fear of giving atom bombs to an ANC-dominated government did not play a role at all. I'm often accused of that. It is not true.
I don't agree with that. The toughest intelligence operations against South Africa were launched by the British and the Americans about our nuclear capacity.
The U.S. government was applying pressure, pushing to convince the government to renounce nuclear weapons.
They were extremely worried that this unique capacity would, in time to come, be under the control of a new government, an ANC government, where very strong ties at that time with Gaddafi and with other regimes. And who is going to control that?
The potential scenarios were all very troubling.
From 1985 onwards, the Cubans in Angola strongly believed that we would probably use one of these devices in a tactical way. The stature that Mr. Mandela actually achieved on the world forums after the handover of power may have turned out to be different if he had a few nukes in his back pocket.
I'm aware that within the ANC, they don't like me very much for having taken the initiative.
I can understand that they are furious about that. Joe Modise was absolutely furious, and he was telling us at a meeting like that, you bloody boere, why the hell have you given in to the pressure from the Americans? This is a very unique South African capacity.
The decision to get rid of nuclear weapons helped to convince the international community that we were not playing games, that we were honest, that we could be trusted, that we were approaching the whole question of fundamental change and a negotiated new South Africa with integrity and honesty.
And it also sent a signal to the rest of the world that we want to focus on what's best for South Africa. We do not want to be a nuclear weaponized state. We want to put our people's aspirations first. Black, white, colored, everybody.
De Klerk played an incredible role. It needed a great deal of courage to do what he did, and we have to pay a tribute to him.
Given the reality of the politics that he had grown up on, Mr. de Klerk has to be celebrated for having recognized that there is only one way forward.
Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.
This is the first time in 78 years that a truly serious meeting takes place between delegations of the African National Congress and the succession of white governments that have ruled our country for generations.
Fact that the white president and the black moral leader of Africa could get together and listen to each other's stories, that was a miracle.
We wanted to build a bridge that would take our country from white minority rule to a democratic system based on one person, one vote.
And that whole process was based on a deep conviction that the problems of our country could only be resolved through negotiation, through talking to each other.
If miracle makes it appear the marvelous Mandela meets the wise de Klerk and the two of them do a deal, and then it's robbing our historic process and the inputs of millions of people over long periods of time of what they really did.
The heart of the story is that South Africans who were at war with each other got together around a table peacefully.
That is what CODESA is about. It is about building a future. It is about correcting that which is wrong in our society.
The negotiations was a roller coaster.
And the down moments were really terrible.
The first part of it, called CODESA, the parties really were feeling out each other.
An organization which remains committed to an armed struggle cannot be fully trusted, cannot be trusted completely when it also commits itself to peacefully negotiated solutions.
De Klerk took a rather strong stand on that. The old man was furious.
I am gravely concerned about the behavior of Mr. de Klerk. He has launched an attack on the African National Congress. And in doing so, he has been less than frank.
Until then, the overwhelming majority of the black people of South Africa, the oppressed, had no faith in negotiations. Their reaction was, yes, you're doing this, but listen, those Boers, they're going to outsmart you. They've got the army behind them, they've got the government behind them, they've got the money in their pockets. But when FW gave that opening, and Madiba hit back.
Even the head of an illegitimate, discredited minority regime as his has certain moral standards to uphold.
All their fears disappeared.
All of a sudden, everybody knew the ANC is a force to take into account. They are strong. They are not going to be dictated to.
They saw that, no, this is a man who is leading a team whose commitment to our freedom is unquestionable, and he is not going to surrender. Overnight, confidence of South Africans in the potential of negotiations was born.
We are still prepared to have discussions with him if he wants. But he must forget that he can impose conditions on the African National Congress.
And in the middle of this, the violence was escalating.
Some extremists are threatening more violence to disrupt the process.
This endless violence, this internecine turf war that was going on, as not only white against black was scrapping, but black on black fights as well across the country.
A piece of cold-blooded savagery that could set back the peace process in South Africa by months, if not years.
It appeared that the violence had assumed such proportions that it would be impossible to sit at the table to negotiate a political settlement.
They're trying to come inside.
There were heady days in South Africa. There were days filled with tension. We didn't really know what was going to happen. There was extreme groups on the white side which wanted to sabotage the whole process of democracy in South Africa.
And his troops brought up believing that black people were inferior.
We are preparing ourselves to resist the radical black communists whom we know will try to destroy us.
When I thought about the right-wing groups, people who are obsessed with the belief in the superiority of their own kind.
Ideologues who are convinced beyond any shadow of doubt that they are right.
When you get that kind of obsession, it's more than just social, it's pathological.
There was a great fear that the far right could take over, that the South African army would join with them, and there would be a coup.
I'm not suggesting that the government should drive the AWB underground. I say they must destroy it.
On the black side, there was divisions between different groups. We had the Zulu-based Inkatha movement on one side.
Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi is head of the Inkatha Freedom Party.
There's a lot of enigmas around the individual who was leading the IFP then and still today.
24 more people have been killed today in fighting between supporters of the African National Congress and its main black rival, Inkatha.
People fighting with spears in this kind of primitive war that was so incredibly violent. Streets filled with people, innocent people being burned, necklaced to death.
It sort of fed into the mythology that Africans aren't ready for democratic rule.
Mandela was accusing the state of covertly being involved in the violence.
They were trying to create mayhem, because if they had succeeded in making a split between the IFP and the ANC, they would have been able to keep power much better.
The security forces are working together with members of Inkatha.
And who is supporting the red-banded tracks of Inkatha? Why are they being allowed to stab and to hack their way to the negotiating table?
The police are deeply involved in this violence. They use funds, state funds, in order to finance the murderous activities of the Inkatha Freedom Party.
This government does not fund murderous activities.
And there were some fantastic reports emerging of the training being given at Caprivi by the South African Defence Force to members of the Inkatha Freedom Party.
I was trained by the military intelligence of South Africa, who was by then in good terms with Inkatha.
There is no difference whatsoever between the government and the Inkatha leadership. They are on the same payroll. It's going to be very difficult for us to continue to negotiate with the government, which is not negotiating in good faith.
Violence was escalating.
People were predicting a bloody racial bloodbath.
There was so much unrest and there was so much uncertainty. It felt like people were walking the streets so determined to fight for what they believed in that nothing was going to stop it.
I had gone fishing, and my host hadn't told me that Rolf Meyer was coming. He represented the apartheid government. I represented the African National Congress.
If I can put it in context, he was very much my enemy at that stage. And of course, he saw us in government as the enemies.
A helicopter lands as I'm holding my rod.
A mutual business friend of ours thought that it could serve a good purpose if the two of us had a closer encounter.
And I get a shock. I say, why was I not told?
He himself at that stage was long time already a fisherman, and I've never become one.
And he wanted me to teach him how to fish. He was so clumsy with a fishing line and a hook, it got embedded in his finger.
The hook landed up in my ring finger, literally, and broke off.
And I said, look, this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to give you a stiff tot of whiskey. Just gulp it down, close your eyes, and I'll take this hook out.
Cyril said, okay, give me a set of pliers.
And I just took it out.
One twist with the set of pliers and pulled it out.
And he went white as a sheet. He's a white person, but he went even much more whiter than white.
Somebody said, Cyril, you did it. And I said, Cyril, I trusted you to do it.
And that, in many ways, added a new dimension to our relationship.
I had the feeling I would like to know this man better. We came to understand each other, became friends in the end. Cyril and I developed amongst ourselves a slogan that said, there's not a problem that we can't resolve. There was very little that could be thrown at us without us finding a solution and the right way forward.
I remember when we were negotiating, we coined a song, Give Me a Kiss to Build a Dream On. We said, give us a deal to build a dream on. Negotiators on all sides started singing. And it just got enemies to start letting their hair down.
But it was still tough times.
Zulu-speaking Inkatha members had rampaged through Boipatong, cutting down anyone they saw. Beneath the blanket, the tiny body of 9-month-old Aaron Matope, stabbed in the head. His mother had been hacked to death beside him.
We charge de Klerk and his government for complicity in the slaughter that has taken place.
There's no doubt that Boy Patong, for me, saw a shift in power. It saw the moment when Madiba's gleaming smile just shut down for a moment, and behind it you could see real steel.
We will not forget what Mr. de Klerk, the National Party, and the Inkatha Freedom Party have done to our people. I have never seen such cruelty.
Sharpeville all over. Won't we learn? Our country is on the brink of disaster.
The ANC has no option but to break off bilateral and CODESA negotiations.
The whole country sort of thought, oh my God, you know, what's going to happen now? Will we ever get back to that place? Will we ever get back to the negotiating table?
Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.
The Boipatong massacre is one of the most chilling instances of the consequences of the actions of the FW de Klerk regime. There was some evidence that the apartheid forces were involved.
While that was going on, Cyril and Ruth had contacted each other.
I picked up the phone and called Ruth Meyer.
I heard his voice and my reaction was excitement because at least he's talking. And I said to him, what the hell are you doing?
And I said, this has happened. This is a wake-up call to you guys. You are doing certain things behind the scenes, but at the same time, we remain convinced that the only way to resolve the problems of our country is that we should continue talking.
And we literally started meeting the next day. When there's discussions, there's always hope. And I think the positive side of it is the fact that we are, at the moment, talking at the trilateral level between all the parties concerned, that is the government, the IFP, and the ANC.
In a conflict, you have to respect your opponent, to react to them not just as a group, but as individuals. Now, if I just saw them as a group and said enemy, I'm unable to go behind that screen.
Unless you're willing to invest in building a relationship, seeing the other person as he sees himself, a lot of what passes for negotiations are doomed to fail.
If you look your enemy in the eye, you'll never be able to look away again. That beautiful greeting in the Zulu language, Sawubona, which means I see you. I see you and you see me. We encounter one another as people, and we've got to negotiate a way of moving forward.
Meeting outside the mainstream, outside the formal realm, often helps.
The best moments to get to know each other was not while you were actually discussing a subject, but during the coffee breaks.
People get to know each other as people, as humans, and therefore you start trusting the other person.
That type of interaction led to people developing sort of some warmth between them as individuals, as merely as human beings.
And they're able to talk more openly, to talk more off the record, and where you are able to dissect the root cause of what the problem is. We knew that as we dealt with each other, we would tell each other the truth as it stood. And if we made a deal, we would want to stick by that deal.
It was up to us. We knew it. We can't afford to fail. In fact, there were more deaths in the country at that stage than ever before.
We needed to try and channel the issues around the violence, to allow the CODESA and multi-party and the confidential talks to proceed.
And so civil society leadership of the country and the business leaders brought all of us, including the politicians together, to generate a process under which there could be an ongoing successful addressing of this political violence.
And it was the first time ever in the history of this country that all the political parties were there. I wasn't part of the delegation, I was just a guy around there. By 9 o'clock that night, we were in deadlock. When everyone filed out of the room to go and have coffee because we were in deadlock, I thought to myself, this can't be. You know, we've worked so hard and there so many good things have happened. And I just wrote my thoughts on the flip chart. Took it down to Bishop Tutu and said, Bishop, why did you try this? It may break the deadlock. And they agreed that this was the process, and we agreed on the next date. And I thought to myself, well, you know, we've taken the first step. We're on our way in a constructive peace process. Many thousands of lives were saved through the signing of the peace accord. And I remember driving home that night and thinking to myself, well, God, I can go now. I've done my bit.
It was described as a momentous and historic hour in South African political life. 23 of the country's leaders put pen to paper in Johannesburg today and committed themselves and their organizations to peace.
I see the peace accord as a vital moment in South Africa's transition.
In recent weeks, there have been some hopeful signs as newly organized peace monitors have been able to defuse a number of crises. These volunteers from all factions and races now oversee most demonstrations and help mediate disputes.
Once we began to think more about tomorrow, the more the concept of enemy, us and them, began to get blurred.
Comrades, we laid the very foundations of political democracy and non-racialism in our land.
Anybody associated with communism or the South African Communist Party was seen as the real enemy. Joe Slovo was framed in that picture.
They demonized my father because he was a prominent white communist.
Some of them believed that Slovo might have had 4 arms and 10 legs or something like that.
When Mandela and de Klerk first met to decide on how the negotiations were going to happen, Mandela told de Klerk that he was going to bring my father, Joe Slovo, as part of his delegation. De Klerk said, I will not sit opposite that man. And Mandela said, I choose my delegation and you choose yours. And eventually, they did sit together.
Joe Slovo was a surprise, highly intelligent, quite efficient when it came to help evolve consensus agreements.
If we don't succeed here, I think the country's in trouble.
He was very, very constructive during the negotiations.
Whatever happened to you first, Slovo clearly played a role as a man who was bigger than what we ideologically believed of him.
It was, ironically, Joe Slovo who came up with the sunset clause.
It was, in fact, my father who proposed the sunset clauses.
In every other liberation movement, the colonial state hands over power, and it packs its tents and its officials, and it clears off. In South Africa, I suppose, the apartheid regime were very nervous about that.
And that led to the proposal, let's guarantee them their jobs for 5 years.
They recognized they had to give something to the other side, and they found a way through that.
He assured the white politicians that they would get their pensions and they would get their homes, etc., and they would get one vice presidential position.
5 years of sharing power, rather than a complete break that could have caused instability, was a magnificent way to resolve that conflict.
Slovo was enough of a South African patriot to understand that the sunset clause was crucially important to stabilize the situation.
We can all leave this earth in peace, having achieved what we have achieved.
What the South African situation helped to make people realize is that you can't dismiss anyone.
It is really time now for the people to have their say.
A country's political life is not solely in the hands of political formations.
We have to also recognize the importance of the contributions of ordinary people.
The everyday, decades-long struggle of a people finding its voice.
Their voice carries a lot of weight, a lot of influence. Lets everybody work together, and that's the key.
Each voice began to be heard and joined with other voices, and it brought about change.
This is Radio Freedom.
The fact of the matter is that apartheid is wrong.
The picket outside the South African embassy by the London branch of the anti-apartheid movement was kept going for 1,395 days.
Millions of people were engaged in the anti-apartheid movement. People around the world were not just engaging in protest, but they were persuading their governments, their institutions, and even business organizations to take economic action.
People, as a people, are the makers of their history.
Our people wanted change, and they worked hard. They sacrificed a lot to get this miracle underway.
I remember in the 50s, a white foreman was standing over there, grinning like a Cheshire cat, very happy about his boys digging a trench. And they'd be singing a song which saying, "Damn the white man who calls us boy." And, you know, he didn't understand a word of what they were saying, but they were cursing him, voicing protest.
Would you keep silent and do nothing if you were in our place? Would you not resist if you were allowed no rights in your own country because the color of your skin is different to that of the rulers?
When the opportunity presents itself to use whatever you have, whatever place or category you hold, to use your voice, to use your work, to use your life, to speak up and to speak out.
The line that BBC adopts is to explore as much as possible non-violent means.
1977, and words of peace from Steve Biko, president of the BPC, the Black People's Convention. It was the last time he was interviewed on camera.
When his imprisonment was announced, it seemed that there was enough publicity around the world that those in power wouldn't allow him to come to any real harm.
8 months later, Biko was dead.
Stephen Biko had been brutally killed in a prison.
To this day, I'm not sure he was deliberately murdered, but they certainly beat the hell out of him.
Peter Gabriel sang the most remarkable anthem about Biko after he died.
Today is not just a day for Steve Biko, it's a day for all those people who suffered in the struggle for freedom.
All 100,000 people in the streets were singing along with him. Nelson Mandela was singing along with him. I mean, I had tears in my eyes.
You don't get over a loss, but you live with it and you develop a perspective. I have to think about my son, whom I share with him, to turn the mourning of the loss into a celebration of the life.
To rise in such a way that your vision transcends what you even thought was possible.
To find that thing that drives you, the thing that makes your life feel like it has a certain amount of value. In the end, that's the only thing that matters.
I am compelled to make as much of a contribution as I can to completing the work that so many, including Steve Biko, have sacrificed their lives for.
We've got to salute all those who sacrificed their lives for the struggle for freedom.
On the side of the black people, Chris Hani had already become an icon and a symbol of a refusal to surrender.
Chris Hani was probably the second most popular black leader in the country at that stage after Mr. Mandela.
Hani, who clearly Mandela saw as the future, as his successor.
I was in my house in Johannesburg when I received a call from a journalist who asked me if I'd heard if anything had happened to Chris. So I called up Tokyo's number and found Judy at home, Tokyo's wife. I asked where Tokyo was, and she said, oh, no, he's gone over to Chris's place. And I said, what's happened? And then she says to me in Afrikaans, his daughter is here. So I said, yes, but what's happened to Chris? And then she says, well, the daughter is here because he's just been shot and he's dead.
The murder of Chris Hani was the touch-and-go moment.
Devastated, I just want to cry for our country. I just broke down, and wept like a child.
Hani's assassination was an Armageddon moment for South Africa. It unleashed a passion and emotion that could have completely disintegrated and destroyed it.
It took us right to the brink.
That was one of the scariest moments.
That could have been the end.
That moment, our country could have been plunged into bloodshed.
That's probably the closest this country has ever come to burning.
His murder was an opportunity for many of us who dreamed of an insurrection to overthrow white minority rule, where we would get our people to take over the streets and the townships and simply through carnage and mayhem make the country impossible to rule and take power. And already the country was erupting. People were looting, burning down buildings. The temptation would have been to say, here's a powder keg, let me light the match. And then Mandela went on television.
We literally rushed him into the SABC studios. There had been no time either to give him a thorough briefing. He was even wearing his glasses on camera.
And he found a way to bridge the black-white divide.
A white woman of Afrikaner origin risked her life so that we may know and bring to justice this assassin.
A terrible deed has happened. But out of this terrible deed, we must now take this country forward.
Every moment in the life of a nation can be seen either as the darkest moment or the brightest moment. Usually, both are present, and it is our opportunity, by the way we respond, to determine what we make of it.
Chris Hani has made the supreme sacrifice. The greatest tribute we can pay to his life's work is to ensure that we win freedom for all our people.
People got so close that they looked down into that abyss, and what was there was so terrible that, in fact, an election date was struck 3 or 4 months after the murder of Chris Hani, because people just said, we have to get to this election, come hell or high water.
This was the darkest night facing our country, but it was the brightest moment of our country.
Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.
right up until the election in 1994, really felt like at every turn there was a chance that it wouldn't succeed.
Last Thursday, South Africa celebrated National Peace Day. Since then, 145 people have been killed in violent incidents. The Transitional Council has less than 8 months to make the country safe enough to hold an election.
If there ever was a miracle, the miracle was how we pulled through those elections.
Between the years of 90 and 94, more people were killed in political violence in South Africa than had been killed in the 30 years before.
As South Africa lurches towards its first democratic poll, the violence shows no signs of abating. A state of emergency has been declared in Natal.
I'd say in some of these areas, the chances of holding a free and fair election would be extremely difficult.
There will not be election, I think so. And if there will be election, the government and the ANC will be responsible for what will happen on that day. I command them not to vote.
Buthelezi, citing constitutional objections, has ordered a boycott of the elections.
When I said we're not going to participate, I meant that we're not going to participate. Simple as that.
Buthelezi held out of the electoral process, wanting some magical concession.
I could never understand why and what informed his mind. Maybe it was the fact that he saw himself as the real contender for leadership of the country.
The election is going to be held anyway next month. So at what point does it become useful to continue to resist?
I'm always guided by my principles, whether that was popular or not.
But in the end, they realized that they had to become part of the ownership of the future.
I therefore am pleased to announce that the Inkatha Freedom Party will contest elections in the national and provincial levels, even though it's so late in the day.
They suddenly came back and said, how do we participate?
So in a whole important region, which in a very populated region of the country, there was not going to be an election because the IFP had said they weren't going to participate. And then suddenly when they came in, that whole area had to be serviced.
And it did lead to the sort of frantic addition of Buthelezi to the ballots.
And 80 million stickers then had to be stuck by hand onto 80 million ballots.
The reality is that we were under extreme time pressure.
There were a variety of times when I thought, I just don't know how we're going to make it.
The sort of last vestiges of resistance came with the Bophuthatswana episode.
The Bophuthatswana people had said, we don't want to be in a homeland anymore, we don't want to be in a Bantustan, we want to be in South Africa and we want to be part of it. And the far right drove into Bophuthatswana to take over.
I asked Mr. Terblanche, what were they doing there? And he said, they have come to help. So I said, but we did not ask for your help.
These men with guns driving their bakkies into the street.
The AWB just shoot us. They shoot me in the leg for nothing.
There was a great fear that the far right could take over and there would be a bloodbath. What actually happened was that they were driven out.
And then he demands that I must leave Bophuthatswana. Me, Terblanche, must leave Bophuthatswana. Because I'm busy overheating the situation because of my presence. So I said to him, that's bloody nonsense.
3 of them who were driving out of Bophuthatswana started firing into the crowds. The Bophuthatswana police fired at them and stopped their car.
Are you a member of the AWB?
No. Okay.
Which is your party? Stand back.
Please get me out, please. I'm bleeding.
And in front of our televisions, a black policeman went and basically executed these 3 men.
The pictures made news throughout the world at that point, and I think that moment, whatever had been building up on the extreme right-wing side towards violent change in South Africa, just completely dissipated.
It was an important moment.
Seeing them defeated on national television put paid to the idea that there was a serious right-wing threat. But we still expected something to happen.
There was the potential for explosion from the right-wing groups.
major bomb was placed about 3 or 4 blocks from IEC headquarters. It was so powerful it blew bodies 10 stories high.
Police and soldiers have cordoned off a 4-block area, but so far have no idea who planted the bomb.
And then bombs started going off all over the country in various places.
Police have increased to R1 million the reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for the blasts.
Every day, we started our work with getting from the South African Defense Forces the body count for the day before.
Once again, police are picking up the pieces of an attempt to derail democracy. Authorities now confirm at least 10 people were killed in this attack on black commuters waiting to board taxis for the ride to work.
I saw the red car with the 2 guys, the white guys.
The twisted remains of a car ended up on top of 2 smashed minibuses.
It was a perilous and parlous state the country was in.
No one has claimed responsibility for the blasts.
This can only be the work of enemies of peace and democracy.
The aim was to scare people from participating in the elections.
State President F.W. de Klerk has strongly condemned the spate of bombings.
We have high manpower levels across the country to assure the public that they will be effectively protected when they go to vote.
Between 50 and 60 bomb threats have also been reported on the East Rand in the last 8 hours.
Concentrate on the fact that we have made enormous progress in spite of the attempts of criminals and murderers to derail the process.
We were building up to a devastating civil war.
Many people did not know how close to a disaster everything was. Everything was hanging with a thread.
There was a lot of fear, there was a lot of tension.
People were scared, especially the white voters.
Everybody's frightened.
We're feeling unsafe. It prompted me to get my gun out and come and practice again.
Now that their political dominance is ending, moving companies can barely keep pace with whites packing it all in.
They want to get rid of us, of the whites, and honestly, they're trying to get in black guys in our positions. For many, the time has come to leave South Africa. Immigration is up by nearly 40%.
As far as people who are leaving the country, I do not have to apologize. Let them go. Because in that process, real South Africans are being sorted out.
A number of foreign governments had prepared emergency evacuation plans for their citizens.
A lot of people were afraid of the future. But I still remember how excited South Africans were.
I'm happy to be part of history.
I'm very excited. I feel we have the right to our freedom to vote.
There was huge excitement.
I don't know what to say. I want peace.
It's incredibly exciting. This is what I've been waiting for my whole life.
I waited all my life to vote for this day, and I feel very, very happy.
We just want to see a brand new South Africa.
We are so excited that we can continue ourselves.
Very few people in the future are going to be able to tell their kids and their grandchildren that they were actually part of something as great as this.
Dis gereed. Hierheen gaan lughawe toe.
Good morning and welcome to this very special day in the history of South Africa.
27th of April, 1994. It was just so amazing.
The sky was blue. It was a blue that I had never seen before.
I woke up at 5 o'clock
expecting that I will be the first one to be on the queue. But to my surprise, when I get there, the queue was so long.
By 7 o'clock, the queue was just spiraling.
People lined up for hours and hours.
Long, 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 long lines.
To finally have a chance at democracy.
To drink from this cup of freedom.
We are 2-3 inches taller than we were yesterday.
People ultimately had faith, and the more they lined up, the more they realized this was the rite of passage into democracy.
This morning, I feel I'm just like being born.
19 people were injured, 3 seriously, when a car bomb exploded at Jan Smuts Airport.
It was a tremendously loud bang. There's a lot of damage upstairs.
And I remember thinking to myself, is this the beginning? Is this where it starts?
Yes, there were a couple of bombs, but actually people were so desperate to get through that day that they behaved.
And I think it shows that that resolve was there and it wouldn't be taken off track by any outside influences.
People were standing in line irrespective of race.
Yellow, black, white.
As they began talking to each other, they discovered, hey, this person is human like me.
Just look at this queue, look at the way we are together, you know. There's no distinction of class or race or anything.
Anything can happen to me after this, I don't mind. As long as I've cast my vote.
It was my first election that I voted in. I felt like I was lucky enough in my lifetime to live through history.
Throughout the day, you got overwhelmed by emotions.
The sense that you're standing on the brink of history.
Thinking that nothing could have stopped this election.
Voting stations were overcrowded and ill-prepared. This one opened 5 hours late because pencils, boxes, and ballot papers had not arrived. 80-year-old Archibald Mkhize and his wife were about to go home without voting when we saw them.
And here and there and there and there. I don't know what's going on.
Those who will return home, they'll never come back again.
Sabotage and irregularities are coming from every direction.
We had reports of ballots not reaching certain polling stations, so people could not vote. There were voting materials that didn't get there in time. There were allegations of fraud.
Large numbers of ballots had gone missing.
Voters queued up early, only to be kept waiting for hours. There were no ballot papers.
And all this was coming to us at the SABC, and we just shook our heads at thinking, is this going to work?
By noon, the IEC had received 277 reports of incidents relating to lack of materials at various points.
The country ran out of ballots.
It was a major problem that could have upset the election and derailed it.
The order was given that local printers could be instructed.
I was at home and I got a call to come back to work.
When we arrived at 7:30, they said to us, we've got an urgent job. We're doing the ballot forms.
When I got here, I saw chaos.
Police vehicles were outside.
There's a lot of security, IEC officials sitting all around.
They printed until about 10 o'clock the next morning, right through the night. And they printed enough ballots for KZN. But similar operations were taking place up in Pretoria and in Johannesburg. In a number of elections around the world, you have indelible ink, which they put on your thumb. Because of the expected intimidation, they decided to use invisible ink. And the problem with invisible ink is you can't see how much you put on. And so they ran out of ink pretty fast, just like they ran out of ballots. Calls were being made saying, can you make the ink? And they had to make ink just like they had to make ballots throughout the night. The fact of the matter is that after the first day of general voting, insufficient people had voted for the election to work.
There will tomorrow also be the opportunity for voters to vote.
Rest assured, the ballot papers that are lacking at the moment will be supplied.
Ballots had to be moved throughout the night. We just didn't have sufficient cars. We put out a call and just said, look, we need help. Cars just started arriving. And it was quite an extraordinary thing, 2 kilometers queue of cars, people who decided that they wanted to help. The Air Force was called in.
Ballot boxes had to be taken by helicopter using the South African Defence Force, which was flown by pilots who belonged to the old South African Defence Force.
I was the officer commanding of the 15th Squadron at that stage. We were responsible for the distribution of the ballot boxes and voting papers all over Natal. It was a lot of paper, a lot of boxes, a lot of people running around. So it was a little bit chaotic from the start. Eventually, I just told my people, just go out there and whatever the IEC wants of you, just do it. Go out and help that the election is a success at the end of the day.
So choppers and C-130 transport aircrafts were taking off from Waterkloof Air Base with us and just literally distributing them all over the country.
Queuing in the bush today, rural South Africans with one last chance to vote. This is an area where ballot papers failed to arrive until dawn this morning, when planes finally brought in the necessary supplies.
We've come a tremendously long way. It's gone astoundingly well around the country. And the dear little old ladies who are stocking up tinned food are probably feeling silly at the moment and looking for a market.
People had expected there would be a massive amount of violence.
And perhaps that's another miracle, that there was not one crime reported across the country, so even the criminals went to vote.
For us, it wasn't just a political act. It was a deeply spiritual experience.
You realize the power of what it means to people who have never been allowed to vote in their lives to finally walk out, cast a vote.
This world-class example of what democracy could be.
There was a sort of a harmonious, synchronicitous coming together.
The culmination of grace, all the work and sacrifice and suffering that so many people had done to make that day possible.
It affirmed us, all of us.
After the election day, we had this horrendous nightmare of the counting, high drama.
The first 24 hours of vote counting tallied less than 10% of some 15 to 20 million ballots. Some places there were ballot boxes and no counters. Other places, too many counters and no ballots to count.
What is important is that the people who have voted now want to hear the results.
We had reports of ballot box stuffing.
It was found that the ballot papers in some of the boxes were neatly stacked, apparently having been sorted.
You know, there's clear fraud, so we put them on the one side. And the IFP said, you count those things, otherwise we call an end to the election in this province. Praveen Gordon, who was one of the senior ANC leaders in the province at that point, walked in and he said, count them. I think it was a remarkable manifestation of someone's ability to see the big picture, because if they hadn't counted them, it would have resulted in violence. 3 minutes past 5 on the morning of the 3rd of May, we found something. Someone had hacked into the system and multiplied the votes of 3 of the political parties by 0.033.
It was registering votes that were not cast,
which threw the entire count into question.
The computers had been rigged. This was not an accident.
Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.
What we are going to do now is look at a result. We understand that there's a new result waiting in the wings to come onto the screen. So we are going to pause for a moment as we see whether that result is in fact going to come up. Nope, there is no result. So we're going to hang on a moment till we see that one. In fact, the flow of the results has now taken something of a breather.
There was an electronic feed to a huge media center that had been set up, where you had these sort of counting boards, just like you do at an airport, you know, it's like that. And suddenly that just closed down. The country basically went into a state of limbo. What's happened to the election? The longer that continued, the greater the panic, and you had incidents of violence starting to rise in certain areas. Fortunately, we had a manual count, a verification, which was being run. But for a period of about 2.5 days, the country was in a state of no news. But eventually the manual count did catch up, and passed the electronic count. And you saw the results going up, and the country sort of, the political tension just dropped.
It is a jubilant scene in South Africa this morning as Nelson Mandela has been sworn in.
Mandela devient le président de l'Afrique du Sud.
Nelson Mandela's ANC easily won the South African election.
Vom Staatsfeind Nummer 1 zum Präsidenten. Dieser Tag war die Krönung im Leben von Nelson Mandela.
We are starting a new era.
I was in my kitchen when I heard of Mandela winning the election.
I was in Bosnia, and I remember all of us wishing that we could have been in South Africa, watching this amazingly positive story unfold.
This was not just little history, this was big history.
When Mandela took over the country, it changed my whole life.
In my heart, I felt that, we all had equal rights now.
That was een ander wêreld geweest vir my daardie dag.
It was a birth of a new era.
Kwabamnandi ngohlobo olumangalisayo. Sajabula sabanga umsindo, sakikiza. Sijabule.
No matter how dark your past is, no matter how divided your past is, if you truly empower people, all people, and if you tell them that part of their power is not just the power to vote, but the power to be a free and equal citizen afterward, then all things are possible.
South Africa made a triumphant return to the world of nations today when Nelson Mandela was inducted as the country's first democratically elected president.
Then the moment the world had been waiting for, the arrival of Nelson Mandela.
This is a very exciting moment. It's the victory of the people of South Africa.
We're finally there. That which we have set out to achieve has been achieved.
I, Nelson Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa.
Inauguration, never forget that. It was amazing, absolutely amazing.
I watched the South African Air Force fly over in those colors.
And the salute by Afrikaner military of the new president. You heard that roar from down below, which I will never forget. That sense power has shifted.
You just knew that you were hearing a seismic shift.
The moment of possibility born.
I mean, that's powerful stuff.
It left me breathless.
That sense of exaltation, hope.
There's just a freedom in it.
There's freedom that was never there before.
Democracy for the people. Transformation.
Equality.
Peace. The things you were fighting for.
That is the great South African dream.
I always wanted to interview Nelson Mandela, and I've never had the chance. One day, I was in the underground parking lot, and I saw this hubbub around one of the trailers, and out stepped Nelson Mandela. And I thought, this is my chance. I'm going to go right up there, I'm going to ask him for an interview, and he's going to say yes, and it's going to be great, and it's going to be an exclusive, and wow, this is going to be my dream come true. So I walked right up there, and do you know what? I did something very uncharacteristic for myself. I could not bring myself to break the zone of privacy that was around him. get an invite to a state dinner. And there's a long receiving line, and I had just passed, the president, and I said, hello, Mr. President. And then Madiba leaned forward, he goes, Alfred, it's me, Nelson. Remember me? And suddenly Bill Clinton's head went, and we all kind of chuckled. I said, oh, Madiba, nobody ever, ever will forget you. One of my favorite all-time moments with Nelson Mandela, when we had him here for the Oprah show, and he's in the green room, and he turns to me and says, what's the show about? I go, the show is about you. The show is about you. That's all it's about. It's just about you.
ICT services and solutions are what we do. Relationships are what we're about. Miracle Rising South Africa is brought to you by Dimension Data.